Over the past decade, several states have passed laws that open women's bathrooms, locker rooms, and shelters to anyone who identifies as a woman, including biological males. Many women have objected, citing issues of privacy and safety. Men who identify as transgender and their allies have dismissed these concerns. They say that no woman would have anything to fear from those who call themselves trans women. This film covers just a small selection of violent and predatory men, all of whom would be allowed into women's most vulnerable spaces under the laws that are being passed around the country. Please watch and decide for yourself whether women have reason to be concerned. Thomas Lee Benson was convicted of both paying to view child pornography and first-degree sexual abuse. The victims were grade school girls in his neighborhood. He was caught in a women's changing room and was sent to prison. On release, he was designated a predatory sex offender. 5 years later, he put on women's clothes and entered a dressing room where girls were changing into swimsuits. 2 years after that, he was caught yet again in a women's changing room. A few years later, dressed in a bra, wig, and lipstick, he was caught after invading yet another girl's locker room. Taylor Buehler put on a bra and a wig and entered a women's bathroom at a community college to spy on women. The police found a pair of women's underwear in his front pocket. He admitted that he was the suspect in an earlier voyeurism incident at the same school. In that incident, he took a shower in the girls' locker room for sexual gratification. Dressed in a wig and women's clothing, Jason Pomare snuck into a Macy's bathroom to videotape women. He reached under stalls and filmed women using the toilets, acquiring hours of footage. Lila Perry is a teenage boy who insists he is a girl. The school district gave him a private restroom, but he wanted to use the girls' locker room, and so he started using it. The girls organized a school walkout in protest. The federal government is now threatening schools with loss of funding if they don't give in to the demands of teenage boys to access naked girls. James Jimmy Lilly is a 24-year-old man who identifies as transgender and says he is in the process of becoming a woman. He is a youth minister and is getting a teaching degree. He has also been charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a female juvenile, including 1 count of incest, 1 count of second-degree sexual assault, and 31 counts of first-degree sexual abuse. The victim was 9 years old when he started abusing her, and he continued until she was 16. Since news of his arrest went public, police say they are receiving claims that Lilly may have committed sex crimes in other states. Norwood Smith Burnes has a long record of indecent exposure and was on probation for public indecency when he was arrested yet again. Burnes started in the women's section of Walmart, pulling up his skirt to expose his white girdle and dark thong underwear. He laid on the floor and took off more clothes to expose himself to young children and was subsequently arrested again. Michelle Lale Norsworthy. Norsworthy served 28 years in prison for a second-degree murder conviction. He shot his victim 3 times during a fight. He has a history of domestic violence, of beating up women. While in prison, he decided he was really a woman. He has since been paroled. Patrick Hagan, a.k.a. Patty Lou Hagan, is a 6'3", 280-pound martial arts expert. When a woman questioned his presence in the women's bathroom, he punched out 5 of her teeth, ultimately costing her $60,000 in medical expenses. He was given a 5-year sentence. Hagan is featured in the documentary Cruel and Unusual about men in prison who identify as transgender. He says he was locked up for getting in a bar fight and neglects to mention that the bar fight was him attacking a woman and punching her teeth out for questioning his presence in the women's restroom. On 2 occasions, 40-year-old Mario Morales Herrera has dressed as a woman and set up a camera in the bathroom of a public library. A 10-year-old girl was among his victims. He was living in a homeless shelter at the time of this incident. 2 months later, he put on a skirt, entered the same bathroom, and slid a camera phone under the stall wall to record a woman using the facility. He was placed under arrest. Under questioning, Morales described himself as a curious little boy. "I have watched thousands of videos like that," he said. According to the prosecuting attorney, the defendant's interest in violating the privacy expectations of individuals is long-standing. He has gone to great lengths to surreptitiously record his victims, including disguising himself as a woman in order to gain entrance into public restrooms. His conduct is predatory and he poses a danger to the safety of the community. According to Washington state law, men dressed as women now have the right to use women's bathrooms, so he will be allowed access to vulnerable women and girls. According to the federal government's Office of Housing and Urban Development, he should also be allowed to stay in a homeless shelter for women. Albert Weber is a convicted child rapist. He thinks he is a woman and has changed his name to Dee Dee Weber. His case has been taken up by the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, the largest advocacy group providing legal assistance to men who identify as transgender. They are fighting for the right of all men to be housed in women's prison if they so desire. This includes men like Weber who are rapists. Juliana Tourmaline Fielkowski, formerly known as Joseph David Fielkowski, ran a support group for teens who identify as transgender and was lauded as a hero in the transgender press. He is now facing 8 felony charges of possessing child pornography. Mark Lazarus is a 39-year-old cross-dresser with an obsession for skirts. He has a history of attacks against women and girls while dressed as a woman. In one incident, he walked behind a group of schoolgirls, muttering, "Skirt, skirt." In his latest assault, Lazarus stood outside a public bathroom for over an hour, waiting for a woman wearing a skirt to enter. He followed a 71-year-old woman into the bathroom, stripped off his outer clothes to reveal a skirt and tights, and attacked the pensioner as she washed her hands. He dragged her into a cubicle and attempted to rape her. He was apprehended by a passerby as he fled the scene. Lazarus has been rated extremely dangerous by both a psychiatrist and probation officer and highly likely to commit further attacks. The judge at his custodial sentencing said, "You have a predilection for dressing in skirts, and that is exactly what you did when you went out looking for sexual stimulation and intending to commit a sexual offense. Your victim was a vulnerable lady in a public situation, and you attacked her for your sexual gratification. It was only because she fought you off and made so much noise and commotion that you stopped and fled." Jane Doe was an extremely violent male teenager in state care in Connecticut. He targeted female staff at multiple programs as well as girls placed there for care. His history of violence includes stabbing a female peer with a fork, 4 assaults or threats on female staff, an assault on a female peer resident, 10 assaults on staff, 3 of them serious, and several attempted assaults on staff while at another facility. These assaults included punching a staff person in the face and using an object to assault staff and assaulting another peer. At another residential program, he assaulted a female staff person, broke her jaw, and temporarily blinded her in one eye. He was judged uniquely dangerous in that no other youth at the Connecticut Juvenile Training School has exhibited such a long-established pattern of assaults. He was thus transferred from the custody of the Department of Children and Families to the Department of Corrections and placed in a private cottage at an adult female prison facility because no juvenile female space was equipped to accommodate violent male offenders. Connecticut state gender identity laws prevented the male teen from being transferred to any one of the many appropriate juvenile male units. Male teens who believe they are female are given the chance to be housed with juvenile females on the basis of that belief. But as a result of transgender activism, Jane Doe was transferred out of the female prison and placed in one of the juvenile female units at Middletown's Child Psychiatric Institute. In a development that should surprise no one, providing him with access to female victims resulted in more assaults. He attacked a teenage girl and a female staffer. He was then transferred to a juvenile male facility. Christopher Hambrook sexually assaulted a 5-year-old girl. While out on bail, he sexually assaulted a 27-year-old mentally challenged woman. He was found guilty of both assaults and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He had no empathy, no remorse, or understanding of his victims and his offenses, said the court psychiatrist. In 2011 and 2012, Hambrook checked himself into 2 women's shelters in Toronto, calling himself Jessica and claiming to be transgender. He proceeded to terrorize, stalk, and sexually assault 2 women, one of whom was deaf as well as homeless. Said the Crown Attorney, Mr. Hambrook's conduct inflicted severe psychological damage on both victims. They sought refuge at Toronto women's shelters at difficult times in their lives. They thought that they would be safe there, but instead they were further victimized by the accused. In 2012, Bill 33 was enacted by the Ontario legislature. It banned discrimination based on gender identity and gender expression. Gender identity has no definition beyond an individual's internal feelings. Men like Hambrook have a legal right to women's shelters. Hambrook could have brought a discrimination complaint against the shelters if they had denied him access, or even if they had asked for proof of his gender identity. Barbara Hall, the head of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, calls anyone who disagrees with Bill 33 hateful. She wrote, "We also see continued calls to segregate transgender people into separate bathroom and changing spaces for the good of the larger majority. This is a practice based on fear and stereotypes and is exactly opposite the vision of Ontario's Human Rights Code. And when the fear and stereotypes turn into terror because they are reality, Men who are predators, whether they identify as transgender or not, have already figured out how to access the most vulnerable women using these laws. Mathew Harks has committed sexual offenses against multiple female victims. He befriended parents specifically to prey on their children. He was given a 9-month conditional sentence in 2004 for a sexual assault in Surrey, BC. He then carried out a premeditated attack on a 7-year-old, earning a 3-year federal prison term. His parole documents state he has a strong preference for girls aged 5 to 8. He also has a habit of taking so-called trophies from his victims, such as underwear. Harks is subject to a 10-year long-term supervision order and is in a high-risk offender program. Harks claims to be a woman now and has legally changed his name to Madeline. In Canada, he is legally allowed in women's bathrooms and changing rooms. Richard Chaperone was the first Canadian prisoner to receive a state-funded surgical sex change. He brutally killed Leo James Black, or Lisa Jana Black, with a hammer. Black identified as transsexual, and Chaperone and Black were romantically partnered. Chaperone was sentenced to life with possibility of parole after 15 years for Black's murder. Chaperone sued the Canadian Human Rights Commission, demanding surgery to make him appear more female. He claimed he was psychiatrically disabled due to transgenderism. He changed his name to Cynthia Kavanagh and demanded a transfer to a women's prison. Once there and with penis intact, he sexually assaulted women prisoners. He was then given Canada's first government-funded surgical sex change. 4 years later, Kavanagh had a violent outburst, causing over $50,000 in damage and injuring guards before he was restrained. He was transferred to another women's prison where he continued to assault female inmates. The women are quoted as living in constant fear of him. Prison officials said that Kavanagh's violence required a special unit for ultra-violent female offenders. Building such a facility for Kavanagh was proposed because such a facility doesn't exist. It's never been needed for actual females. 2 transgender men who raped a woman have been jailed for a total of more than 30 years for their sadistic offenses. The pair are former lovers, Claire Lawton and Peter Steele, also known as Tanya Steele. Their actions were so vicious that the judge said it was hard to imagine that they belonged to the same human race. He told the jury, "It could not have been a pleasant experience sitting through the trial. While I cannot exempt you from future jury service, I would understand it if you felt a certain reluctance to do this again." Transgender Cynthia Blast started life as Luis Morales. At 16, he was charged with 12 counts of second-degree murder, first-degree arson, and reckless endangerment in a neighborhood fire in which 6 people died. 5 of the victims were burned beyond recognition. Tips from local residents led the police to Morales. As is typical for arsonists, Morales had asked the reporters to take his picture at the fire. He was acquitted in the arson killings after a witness recanted, possibly due to threats by the Latin Kings gang, of which he was a member. There were never any other suspects in that crime. 5 years later, Morales and Carlos Franco were found guilty in the rape and murder of 13-year-old Ebony Williams. Ebony was 13 years old and only 4 feet 2 inches tall. The 2 men held the girl captive, and Morales raped her while repeatedly slashing her body. Franco killed her by breaking her neck. The prosecutor said, "The suffering that this poor child went through is beyond belief and puts this crime in the category of monstrous and barbarous." The men shoved Ebony's body into a box, dumped it on an expressway, and set it on fire. Ebony was only identified through her dental records. They bragged about the crime to friends, many of whom testified against them. The judge chastised both men for their cavalier attitudes throughout the trial. "Their demeanor in this courtroom speaks volumes," he said. From prison, Morales changed his name to Cynthia China Blast. He claims to have had sex with some of the most infamous rapists and murderers in the New York prison system. In a letter to a reporter, he wrote, "It seems that my only attractions are to society's sickest and most twisted lowlifes. I'm actually hoping to be incarcerated with the son of Sam so I can sleep with him while awaiting my sex change outcome in the courts." One killer is Heriberto Seda, the Zodiac killer copycat who shot 8 people and killed 3. Using Seda's MO, Blast sent a letter to the New York Daily News titled, "This is the voice of the Zodiac killer's wife." In the letter, Blast expressed his desire to become a woman and marry the serial killer. "If I was a real woman, I could bring about little future serial killers to terrorize New York City like my husband did." How New Yorkers would have loathed the Zodiac children, Blast said. Cynthia Blast is another man whose case was taken up by the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Their star spokesperson, Laverne Cox, read a letter written by Blast from prison. After public outcry, Cox withdrew support for Blast. Dennis Wayne Wilbert is a convicted child rapist. He spent several years in prison for the repeated forcible rape and sodomy of his 14-year-old stepdaughter. After he got out, he changed his name to Allison Denise Wilbert and took up transgender activism. He served as executive director of the Transgender Human Rights Institute until his past was discovered. He also created an online cyberstalking project where he and his transgender associates doxed and harassed women who questioned men's claim to be women. They posted personal information about targeted women on websites created to facilitate criminal stalking and harassment. Their purpose was to terrorize women who question the concept of transgender and silence any discussion of how gender harms women and girls. Stephanie Walsh is a 53-year-old man who is the father of 7 children. In 2009, he was charged with 14 offenses of assault and uttering threats. His wife and their 2 oldest children, who in their late teens testified against him. Besides the guilty verdict, the court gave his wife and all 7 children a 2-year restraining order against him. He moved to Toronto and became a transgender activist. He was initially employed at a queer community center as a trans consultant. According to other employees, he was fired for being deeply narcissistic and self-absorbed, putting his own attempts at suicide in front of murdered women. He spent 2 years in a women's homeless shelter. He eventually found mommy and daddy through a fetish site. Steffi is not just transgender, he is trans age, claiming to be a 6-year-old girl. His new daddy took him to a swingers club. In an interview, he describes in detail how his daddy anally penetrated him. I felt like a woman. I was surprised I didn't think I was going to be pregnant. I was so much of a girl. I actually have an erection right now from it, so I'm just going to pull my dress down a little bit. Steffi now lives with his adoptive mommy and daddy in a girly girl's dream room of stuffed animals and a closet of crinolines playing with dolls and the couple's young grandchildren. Most importantly, Walsh was instrumental in the passing of Canada's Bill 33, which nullified women's status as a protected class and gave men the right to access all previously segregated spaces. Steffi has the legal right to be anywhere that women and girls are naked and vulnerable. Douglas, aka Donna Perry, is a serial sex killer who has murdered at least 3 women, Yolanda Sapp, Nikki Lowe, and Kathleen Brisboe. Sapps and Brisboe were found completely nude. Lowe's body was partially clothed. Perry has an extensive criminal history reaching back to the 70s. Charges range from reckless endangerment to second-degree assault to using prostituted women. Perry had federal charges brought against him in 1988 for a pipe bomb, 49 firearms, and 20,000 rounds of ammunition. His arrest was precipitated by his assault on his own mother. In 1994, he again faced federal charges for additional firearms and ammunition. His arrest was triggered by a call from a frightened mental health worker who feared Perry was capable of a mass shooting. Perry compared himself to mass murderer Dean Melberg. He referred to himself in the press as a woman in a man's body and stated that guns were like my family and children. He said everybody needs a purpose in life and mine is guns. In 1997, police found weapons and attorney papers in his vehicle. The document stated Perry suffers from a gender psychosis disorder and does not like females. In 2000, Perry had gender reassignment surgery in Thailand and renamed himself Donna. In 2012, a search warrant was executed at his home, and he was arrested again for illegal possession of firearms. While searching the bedroom, an ATF special agent found a closet that had been painted shut. The door was forced open. Inside were several boxes of women's underwear too small for Perry to wear. The agent speculated they were trophies, items belonging to victims that serial rapists and killers keep. Perry's DNA was run through a database and matched tissue found under the fingernails of one of the murder victims, a case that had been cold for 20 years. Investigators ultimately found fingerprints and a bullet that linked him to the murders as well. Detectives also interviewed a woman who had shared a prison cell with Perry in 1998. Perry told her he had killed 9 prostitutes because he couldn't breed, and the women had the ability to have children, and they were wasting it being pond scum. He also said he was a sociopath. In his statement to the police, Perry tried to blame the killings on Douglas. He claimed that he had transitioned to female to stop Doug from being violent. Experts say there is no evidence that hormones reduce aggression or violence. When asked if Doug was responsible for the murders, he responded, "I don't know if Doug did it or not. It was 20 years ago, and I have no idea whether he did it or did not." Perry claims he is paranoid and emotional but won't hurt anybody. Would that comfort you if you were a woman forced to share a prison cell with him? And what comfort do the families of other missing women have? That hidden closet of trophies is cold comfort indeed. Haddon Clark was from a prominent New York family. He trained as a chef but was never able to keep a steady job. Clark joined the Navy as a cook but was given a medical discharge, diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. In February of 1999, Clark dressed in women's clothes and went to several churches where he stole women's purses and coats. He was apprehended by the police. When they opened the trunk of his car, they found the coats and purses, as well as wigs and dresses. Clark said they were his and that he was a woman. In 1993, Clark put on women's clothes, broke into Laura Hodeline's apartment, abducted her, and killed her. He left a bloody fingerprint at the scene. Police arrested him and he confessed to several murders of women and girls along the eastern seaboard between the mid-70s and 1993. He claimed to have drunk their blood along with various mutilations of their corpses. He also confessed to killing Michelle Dorr. Michelle was a 6-year-old girl last seen in 1986 heading to a plastic pool in her backyard. Clark lived 2 doors down. He told the police that he stabbed her to death, threw her in a duffel bag, took her corpse to his home, and ate some of her remains before burying her. When asked why he killed these women, he replied, "I thought if I drank the blood of women, it would transform me into a woman. I wanted to become the woman and girls I killed." In 2000, Clark agreed to show the police the graves of his victims, but in exchange, investigators had to buy some women's clothing for him. The agents went to Kmart and purchased a skirt, underwear, a bra, and a wig. Clark was not able to show them any graves, but he did lead them to a stash of 230 pieces of women's jewelry, his trophies. Included was Laura Hodeline's high school ring. Robert Koselleck was sentenced to life in prison without parole for murdering his wife Cheryl. He approached her from behind, wrapped a wire around her neck 3 times, and strangled her with such force that he nearly decapitated her. He dumped her naked body in the back of her car and left her at a mall. The next day he went on a shopping spree and spent hundreds of dollars on women's clothes. The court record states, with regard to extreme atrocity or cruelty, the prosecution's expert testified that there were multiple wounds on the victim's body. She was strangled by a wire and then rope. She was conscious for at least 15 seconds after strangulation began and remained alive for 3 to 5 minutes, and there were indications of a conscious struggle. These facts amply support a finding of premeditated and deliberate murder, as well as murder by extreme atrocity or cruelty. He changed his name to Michelle while in prison. The state of Massachusetts is paying for hormone treatments, laser hair removal, and psychotherapy. Russell Williams is a decorated Canadian Air Force colonel. He was sentenced to life in prison for 88 sex crimes, including 2 counts of sexual assault and 2 counts of murder. He subjected one of his surviving victims to a 3.5-hour sexual assault. After his crimes, he photographed himself in his victims' underwear and bras. Jillian James is a man who thinks he is a woman and has been in trouble with the law. This trouble includes charges of possession of a gun by a prohibited person and trafficking in Rohypnol and GHB, well-known date rape drugs. He leaves comments like these in public forums to people who don't believe he's a woman. "If I am doing 20 years in prison, I will go on the run, and while they are searching for me, I will hunt every one of you down who has said something negative and gut you. Obviously the system don't want me free, and most certainly I have no rights compared to you ignorant, brainwashed fools who line up one after the other because you can't think for yourself. I'm coming for you and your offspring. I don't value life anymore. Your jeers and negative remarks have taught me enough about the value of human life. I yearn to watch you bleed and cry in pain and gurgle in your own blood." We will be accused of cherry-picking the worst of the worst, but we did not. This film could have been hours long. For each offender here, there are dozens more we could have chosen. And for each offender, there are victims. There are women and children who have been terrorized, violated, and even murdered. Yet these men and their advocates keep telling us that this never happens, that men who wear women's clothing never commit sexual crimes, and that women have no right to privacy, no right to safety, and no right to fear. Decide for yourself.